Welcome to the Full Nielsen. Today I'm going to be doing a comparison of these double action revolvers, all of which are chambered in .22 long rifle. Starting here on the left, we have a Ruger GP100, then we have a Colt King Cobra, a Smith & Wesson Model 617, and a Smith & Wesson Model 17. I'm going to start off with some of the functional differences, primarily as it pertains to the cylinder and how you open the cylinder on each one of these revolvers. To open the Smith & Wesson cylinders, you push this button forward on the side of the frame and then you're able to open the cylinder. Please do not be alarmed that I have casings in these cylinders. They are just casings, not live rounds or live cartridges. I save spent casings so as not to damage the firing pin or the cylinders when I dry fire practice with these double action revolvers. Now this Model 17 holds 6 shots while all of the rest of these revolvers hold 10. Also, this cylinder on the Smith & Wesson, on both of these and on the Ruger, are what I would call countersunk, where they actually go in and they bore a little recess out to fit the head or the rim of the cartridge casing so that it sits flush with the face of the cylinder, whereas the Colt, as you will see later, does not fit flush. They rest on top essentially of the cylinder face. And so anyway, so that's one of the differences to be aware of. Now also, the direction the cylinders turn when fired. The Smith & Wessons turn counterclockwise, and so does the Ruger, whereas the Colt turns clockwise. That doesn't really matter, but anyway, just something to be aware of. So I'll show you this 617. You open, pushing the button forward, you can see that's nice and recessed. And then on the Colt, you pull the button rearward in order to open the cylinder instead of pushing it forward, and you can see that these cartridge casings, the rims of those casings are resting right on top of that cylinder. Okay, they're not, that cylinder's not countersunk or whatever the appropriate term is there. And on the Ruger, there's a little push button here. You just push that down. There's a little pin that goes through this frame here. And when you push that down, it cams that out to release the cylinder. So that's how the GP100 works. In terms of actual, like if you're just going to the range and plinking or whatever, you could train and practice and get used to any one of those methods to open the cylinder. In terms of somebody who might be using these as a competitive shooter where speed might matter, that might be where you would find that one mode of operation is actually far superior to another. I don't have enough experience with any of those disciplines at like a competitive level to tell you which one would be better. I can tell you my personal preference is I'm used to this slide forward mode of operation, and I really like that, and I find that that's pretty quick. But like I said, with practice, I'm sure you could probably be equally good with just about any of them. So that's some of the differences as far as the cylinders, and really the only difference probably functionally with these revolvers. Now, they all have ejection rods, which when you open a double action revolver like this, you just press this ejection rod to knock all the spent casings out. You just give that a whack, and you don't usually do that facing up like this because then gravity's fighting against you. You actually will spin the revolver downward and hit the ejection rod to drop the casings, and then gravity gives you a little bit of an assist with that. Anyway, so they all have, you know, normal double action ejection rods. I know some people say that's silly. Of course they have an ejection rod, but there are some double action revolvers out there that have really weird methods of operation for the ejection rod that is non-standard. These don't fall with any of that, so they're all the same when it comes to that. Now, as far as the grips are concerned, the Smith & Wesson Model 17 comes with wood grips. The Model 617 comes exclusively, I believe, whether it's the 4-inch or the 6-inch barreled model, with these Hogue rubber grips. And I like them okay. I prefer wood grips, the feel of wood grips and the aesthetics of wood grips. I don't believe there's any factory offering that I've seen for the 617 that comes with wood grips. The Colt King Cobra, on the other hand, there are factory options with wood grips. I'm not sure about in the 6-inch model. I know there are in the 4-inch model. Anyway, so be aware of that. And then the Ruger GP100, what you see is what you get as well, just like with these two, or These 3 revolvers here, there are not other factory options for grips. The Colt there is. Okay, that simplifies it a little bit. Now, non-factory options, in the aftermarket, you can get whatever you want. I'm sure there are tons of companies that make wood grips or all kinds of other grips, hoe grips, anything that you would want probably for any of these models of revolvers. As far as what I prefer in grips, I prefer, as I mentioned, the aesthetics and the feel of wood. I prefer the aesthetics on this Model 17. This wood with this blued steel is just a beautiful combination. I really like that. In terms of an actual ergonomic or functionality or shootability perspective, these grips are probably the worst of the grips on this table. Sometimes I don't care about that. Sometimes the aesthetics push it so far over the edge that I can make do with the grips being, you know, not my favorite because it has everything else that I might want. As far as the grips ergonomically that I prefer the most, that would be the Model 617. These grips just fit my hand the best. They don't really, I mean, they do get a little bit larger towards the top, but they don't feel like the Ruger GP100, which feels extraordinarily large at the bottom and then tapers quite dramatically towards the top. This feels a lot more consistent throughout, and this just fits my hand size or whatever better. So I personally prefer the grips ergonomically on the 617. The Colt King Cobra grip is like somebody took a ball of Play-Doh and molded it to their hand, and I think for people with smaller hands, they'll really like it. From an aesthetics perspective, I really don't care for it on the 6-inch barreled model because the proportion of grip to barrel seems off to me. I just don't like that compared to like the 617 that I feel looks a lot more proportional. Again, you can get whatever grips you want that might address that issue. But as far as the actual feel in hand, they feel comfortable, they feel relatively ergonomic, and I think people with smaller hands would probably prefer these grips, maybe even over the 617. But anyway, and as I mentioned, the Ruger GP100, I don't care for how large they are on bottom compared to how small they are on top. I wish they would make this grip just a little more consistent throughout. But anyway, so there you go. That's kind of an overview of the grips. Now, as far as the sights are concerned, they all have fully adjustable sights for windage and elevation. The sights are all metal. When I say all metal, obviously except for the little fiber optic insert that's on the sights. Now, with these 2 Smith & Wessons, they come with all blacked out sights, meaning a blacked out front sight, blacked out rear sight on both of these, okay? And the Colt comes with a fiber optic front, which you may or may not be able to see, and a blacked out rear. The GP100 comes with a green fiber optic front and a not completely blacked out rear. It kind of looks like that Glock little U-shaped white traced outline for the rear sight. I personally prefer all blacked out sights, so I prefer the sights that come on the Smith & Wesson. As I mentioned before with the grips, you can get any sort of aftermarket sights you want for any of these, I'm sure, if you shop around. So that shouldn't be that huge deal. If there's a revolver that you like everything about it other than it doesn't have a fiber optic front sight, I'm sure you could go get a fiber optic front sight and add it to that revolver, but that's something to be aware of as it pertains to the sights. So now I want to talk about the triggers on these 4 revolvers, and there are some differences between them. I'll start off first with the trigger shoes. The Smith & Wesson trigger shoes, as you can see, have a little bit different curvature to that of the Colt and to that of the Ruger. The trigger shoe is this little part here that you're actually pulling when you go to fire the firearm. Now, the trigger shoe width on these is also dramatically different. The Smith & Wessons have a really nice wide, relatively flat trigger shoe, while the Colt has a really thin trigger shoe, and so does the Smith & Wesson. With a double action .22 revolver, they have a really heavy trigger pull weight. And as a result of that, I prefer and find it a lot more comfortable to shoot with the wider shoe than I do with the narrower shoes in double action. So I prefer the trigger shoe on the Smith & Wessons. As far as the double action versus single action and the reset and all that, I'm going to go through that with each one of these revolvers. I really only need to go through it with one of the Smith & Wessons. We'll just go through it with the 617 because they're identical in terms of trigger action feel and smoothness and reset and all that. So in double action, which is with the hammer forward when you pull the trigger, and it rotates the cylinder and you have to overcome the spring tension of the hammer and all of that, these have a really nice smooth pull and it's pretty linear. Now they do have a heavy pull, as I mentioned, because in a double action 22 revolver you need quite a bit of hammer spring tension or pressure in order to ignite rimfire cartridges. Centerfire cartridges don't require as much force to ignite, and so you're never going to get a double action 22 revolver with a pull weight that's anywhere near what you can get a double action centerfire revolver down to. So be aware of that. Now, in single action, which is where when you cock the hammer back, all you've got to do is pull the trigger to allow the hammer to fall. You're not overcoming that spring tension. The Smith & Wessons have a basically zero creep. Yeah, I can't perceive any creep even if I want to. No matter how slow I pull that, there's no creep. It breaks perfectly. It's a nice light pull. Fantastic single action trigger. And as far as the double action is concerned, as I mentioned, very smooth. And the reset, which is a big part, which is after you pull the trigger and you let go, does it assist your finger forward, or do you kind of have to move your finger forward because the spring tension there is not tuned quite right to give you a nice positive reset? Smith & Wesson is phenomenal in every way, in every aspect of a trigger. The reset is fantastic. The single action is fantastic. The double action is fantastic. These have the best triggers on the table, in my opinion. So that's how what you're going to get kind of with those triggers. Now I'm going to move on to the Colt and give you an idea of some of the differences with this trigger. Now this trigger, one thing I didn't mention is, before I move on to that, is the actual hammer tension when you go to cock this back into a single action mode. How much spring tension is there on that hammer you have to overcome? The Smith & Wesson spring tension on that hammer feels heavier than the Colt. The Colt is easier to pull that hammer back than than the Smith & Wesson. So you would expect that this would also have a lighter pull. And I would say in single action, this is very similar to what the Smith & Wessons are. Single action pull on this is phenomenal. There's no creep to speak of. It is a great single action pull. Cocking the hammer is fantastic. No issues there. In double action, on the other hand, you have a nice lightweight pull at the beginning, but then all of a sudden the pull weight ramps up in a non-linear fashion right before that trigger breaks. I don't like that. I think that's going to be harder to get good with than a trigger pull that is nice and linear throughout the entire pull range. So I'm not a fan of the double action pull on this compared to the Smith & Wessons. The double action pull on this is still better than the Ruger though. Now, the biggest qualm I have with this is if you go to shoot it fast, I find that the reset on this is nowhere near as positive as the Smith & Wesson. If I let that off slow, there's just not a lot kicking that finger back to get you ready to fire again, whereas the Smith & Wesson, you got a nice, I mean, it's just, I don't know how to explain it. You just need to get a hold of one of them. Of course, you can't just dry fire them in a store or anything, you'll damage them. But if you have the opportunity to get a hold of a buddies or something like that and see what I'm talking about, the reset on these is a lot better than the Colt. So the only thing that holds the Colt trigger back, in my opinion, is the double action. It's not quite as linear. It gets a little bit more heavy right before the trigger breaks, and I personally don't like that as much. If you were shooting for precision, you might like that. If I'm shooting for precision, I'm going to cock it into single action. But when you're shooting for speed, I don't like that. I want it just a linear pull. Anyway, and then the reset on this is not quite as good. Now, how does the Ruger stack up compared to all of these? This has the worst trigger of the bunch in pretty much every aspect, other than the reset. I mean, the reset is very positive, but the reset is basically overkill. The trigger pull weight on this is several pounds heavier in double action and single action than all of these other revolvers. And so it is really fatiguing to try to shoot fast. And I feel like in terms of trigger travel, maybe it's just the weight and how far the weight combined with how far you're pulling it. I don't know. Maybe it's you're not pulling it any further. It's just the weight. But it is just fatiguing to fire this thing in double action because of how heavy that trigger pull is. As far as the smoothness of it, it came from the factory pretty gritty. So I have dry fired this one thousands and thousands of times, and it has smoothed it out to where it's a nice smooth pull. It's just heavy. Now in single action, there's no, well, there's, on this one, if I remember right, if I pull it real slow, see that? Maybe you can see just that little bit of wiggle. You might not be able to tell. But there's just a teeny bit of wiggle, and then it breaks like a glass rod. And it's not like grit, 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 and then it goes off. It's just, if you were pulling the trigger the way I usually would, which is I would put my finger on the trigger, I'd kind of get it prepped and staged, and then I'd give it a nice pull. Even in single action, I would do that. You're not even gonna notice that creep. So the double action and single action on it, double action smooth, the single action is breaks, not pretty clean. The biggest issue is just the overall pull weight is really what holds up this trigger. Now, as I mentioned, the reset on this thing is the most positive of any of them, but I think that's just because the spring that they've got in this thing for the reset it's about double the weight that it needs to be to have a positive reset and not have to have you overcome that spring when you go to pull the trigger. But anyway, so that's how the triggers stack up. The trigger action is better on the Smith & Wessons by far, in my opinion, than these other two. Now, I would say the Colt is much closer to these two than the Ruger is to any of them. That's how far off the Ruger is from the rest of the competition here when it comes to trigger. Now, aesthetics. This is a very subjective point, and everybody has different preferences. Aesthetically, for me, I love the Model 17. I love that blued steel, the wood grips. It is just an absolutely beautiful gun, in my opinion. So I'm a huge fan of this gun aesthetically. And it doesn't have the big, heavy double underlug or any of that. It just, the proportions and everything on this revolver, it's just a beautiful revolver. So I prefer the Model 17. After that, I think all of these look good in their own particular way. I am going to talk a little bit about the finish when it comes to the aesthetics and what they come with finish-wise. Obviously, I mentioned the Model 17's blued steel. All the rest of these are stainless, but they have different types of finishes. The Ruger has more of a satin finish. It's not really a high polish finish, but I have been very impressed when I look over the revolver with the consistency of the finish. You don't see parts where it looks like it got brushed or whatever they did to get this texture on this stainless where they got it here, but they missed a spot there. It looks kind of scratched up here, but it doesn't look good over there. It looks good everywhere. It looks really good. It's a really nice, uniform, consistent finish. The Colt King Cobra is a more high polish finish, and I've handled this enough, and maybe with the fingerprints and all that, you can't tell. I know they make versions that are even a higher polish, but it is a higher polish and a little bit better finish, in my opinion, than what I've seen on the Smith & Wesson Model 617s. This, in my opinion, is one of the weaknesses of the 617s, is the finish is not very consistent. It's almost like they went for something in between a nice satin finish, which looks nice and consistent, and a high polish finish, and so it just looks kind of scratchy in some places. If you ever pick one of these things up and you look like at this part of I wanted to call it the receiver, this part of the frame, you'll notice it just looks like somebody kind of scratched it up. It just doesn't look very consistent. And so if I had to rate the finishes personally, I'd rate this number 1. I would rate probably the Colt King Cobra number 2, then the Ruger number 3, or maybe both of these number 2. Again, different styles of finishes, but they're both very consistent and they both look really good. And the Smith & Wesson Model 617 would come last for me in terms of the finish department. Now, accuracy. This is going to come down to the shooter more than anything. I always hate the accuracy comparison thing because the reality is unless you have a ransom rest that takes the human element completely out of the equation, it's locked down in a vise and it can't move, and then you're checking the inherent accuracy of the platform. And when I say inherent or mechanical accuracy, I mean if you take all of the human factor out of the equation, how accurate are they? That's the only way to get a true gauge of the accuracy. Everything beyond that has more to do with the human element than it does the guns themselves. In other words, these guns could probably shoot a group that is twice as, or half the size, or a quarter the size of what, if you put them in a ransom rest, of what most human beings are capable of with them in their hands. Now, with that being said, there is the human element. There are certain things that make them more shootable. It's not an inherent accuracy thing. It's not a mechanical accuracy thing. It's just the shootability of which one is easier to get the accuracy potential out of than the others. And what I find is that usually comes down to trigger action on almost any gun that I shoot. That with most guns, if you have a nice trigger, it's a lot easier to shoot a gun with a nice trigger well than it is a gun with a lousy trigger, all other things being equal or similar. So my guess would be, if you want to know the mechanical or inherent accuracy, these would be nearly identical. You wouldn't find one that is necessarily going to shoot way better than the other. If you want to know which ones I'm going to shoot better, I can tell you it's going to be these two. And it's, as I mentioned, it comes down to that trigger action, both in double action, single action. All of that stuff lend themselves to me being able to get more accuracy out of the guns easier. And as I mentioned, at speed, the trigger action and the reset and all of that whole combination, the linear trigger pull, I'm going to be able to shoot these more accurately at speed than I am these other two, and I'm going to be able to shoot them probably almost identical to the King Cobra in single action, because as I mentioned, the single action on this is basically identical to these two. So anyway, so that's how I would go through the accuracy thing. Now, my personal rankings for these, which one do I like the best? And again, this is my personal ranking. I like all of these. I'm a big fan of double action and single action revolvers. I think they are the most beautiful firearms a person can buy. I think they're more beautiful than any kind of lever action. They're more beautiful than any modern wonder thing or any of that kind of stuff. I think they're more beautiful than 1911s, and I think there's some pretty beautiful 1911s, but double action and single action revolvers are the most beautiful firearms, in my opinion, to collect. I really enjoy them. So as far as the one I like the best, the Model 17 is the one that I like the best. As I mentioned, the proportions of it between the barrel and the grip and the wood grip and the blued steel, it is just an absolutely beautiful firearm. This video will probably not do it justice. If you ever have the opportunity to handle one in a gun shop, go handle one, and you'll probably see what I'm talking about. After that, I would probably say it's a tie for me between sorry, I was just talking about the aesthetics of it. I get lost how much I like this gun looks. It's not just the aesthetics. Now, as I mentioned, the ergonomics of this are not as good as the 617, but I think it makes up for it in the aesthetics department, and I think it makes up for it in terms of the balance of the revolver and not having the heavy double underlug and all that, which you can get 4-inch versions of both of these that help with that. But overall rating, including the aesthetics, including everything, the trigger action, all of it, the Model 17 would be my number one. Everything after that, these two would tie for number two. I think this one beats out the 617 slightly in aesthetics because I think the finish is a little bit better. The 617 has better trigger action. I think it's more shootable than what the Colt is. So I would say these two are a tie for me overall when I take everything into consideration. And the Ruger GP100 I would put in third place out of these three. Now, if you could fix the trigger in that gun and lighten it up quite a bit, I think you could easily make it on par with these three for me. The biggest separator, if you had all the trigger action, all that sorted out on these, would be the aesthetic aspect, which is, again, subjective, and that's where this revolver is in a league of its own, in my opinion. The Model 17 is just a beautiful revolver. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is price, and that is, that has changed a lot. You used to not be able to get a hold of these at all. During COVID, it was kind of a mess because they just flat out were not available. And the 617, the one or two I could find in stock everywhere I searched online or everywhere I searched in local gun stores, they wanted huge money for them. I want to say it was like $950. They were really expensive. Nowadays, you can actually find these three are pretty available most places nowadays if you have a decent gun shop or if you're shopping online, and they can be had for anywhere from the $750 to $850 price range, which is great compared to what things have been in the past. and then or over the past couple of years. The Model 17, on the other hand, is about $950 to $1,050, so it is more expensive, and I think that's probably the bluing and all that. Maybe that takes more time or energy, or I don't know the reason why it's more expensive, but it is more expensive than the other three. So that gives you an idea, price-wise, of kind of what you'd be looking at with some of these. Now, I think that pretty much concludes my comparison. These are not the types of things I would recommend for somebody who does not own any firearms unless they simply want to be a collector. They just want to go to the range for fun. If they're actually wanting to develop some proficiency for concealed carry guns and things like that, I would recommend things like this. Because they operate like most concealed carry guns, I would not recommend a revolver. But for people who love the beauty of firearms and the mechanical aspects of firearms and want to collect some firearms, double action and single action revolvers like this are awesome, in my opinion. If you guys have any comments or questions, feel free to leave those in the comment section below. If you found this video at all informative or helpful, I would appreciate it if you would like and subscribe. That helps us grow the channel so we can create more content like this that will hopefully help give people opportunities to see some comparisons done on things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to see. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day.